Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Dorr. I work as the Director of Professional Development at ISA. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on grant writing. Today, I'm with Naomi Head from the University of Glasgow, Leah Windsor from the University of Memphis, and Mark Boyer, who is also a part of ISA and a professor at the University of Connecticut. So the plan for today is to have each of our panelists speak for a few minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor for discussion and questions. You can put your questions in the chat, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can put them in the Q&A. So we'll go ahead and get started. Naomi, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to speak to so many of you who have signed up for today. I'm just going to share my screen briefly with a couple of slides. So yeah, my name is Naomi Head. I'm a professor of international relations at the University of Glasgow in politics and international relations. And I want to talk briefly about three things today. And maybe it's worth prefacing this by saying I'm a qualitative researcher. All of my research works with qualitative research, and that's largely been kind of both theoretical and fieldwork oriented. So just to kind of situate some of that. And I want to talk about three things. First of all, kind of what's right for us as individual researchers, and what's right for me, thinking about different types of grants. Secondly, learning from failure, and all too frequent experience, I think, often, and something worth bringing into the light. And thirdly, how do we think about balancing expectations and reality in our grant journeys? So some of this may seem very obvious, but perhaps it's worth kind of just piecing together some of these parts of the puzzle to think about how we can strategically think about how to develop our research and our grants capture in the way that's best suited to us. So starting off by thinking about what's right for me, and this is really about recognizing that what you need to do your research will look different to your colleagues. And so thinking about, some people may need lots of money for research activities looking kind of involving fieldwork or surveys, big data, research assistance. Others really don't. Others might need very small pots of money that allow them to do their research. I think it's really worth saying that neither is better. There isn't one model that is the right kind of grant. And that's really important to say, to recognize that we have different needs, and looking for grant opportunities that meet those needs is a perfectly legitimate way to think about developing your research. I think there's a tendency to think that bigger is better because of the value that's often placed by institutions on grant income and the role that it plays in thinking about career development. But thinking about what's right for our research needs, I think, is really important. It's also, I think, really important for being successful. So looking at the kinds of grant schemes that suit what you need, that are able to support your research needs, are more likely to lead to success. And there are a few ways of thinking about that might help, particularly earlier on in careers. So thinking about seed corn funding, looking for opportunities. Sometimes these can be internal to your institution, sometimes they can be external. Professional associations are an excellent place increasingly to look for small amounts of funding, particularly for early career researchers. And seed corn or pilot funding is also often, I think, a good way to build credibility and to be able to develop a track record that will be persuasive to funders as you apply for bigger grants later on, perhaps in your career. So thinking about where is a good place to look, first of all. And thinking about, again, what do you need money for? Do you need time, for example? So sometimes thinking about particular kinds of grant applications for fellowships that can bring you time, but aren't necessarily going to bring a lot of research expenses funding, can be helpful if that's what's most suitable for the kinds of research that you're looking for. Do you want to build a research team? Do you need to have a research team? Thinking about the kinds of collaborations that you're interested in will also help shape thinking about the opportunities that you're looking for. Thinking about where you go for advice. I think advice is hugely important. So thinking about whether you have colleagues in research offices in your institution. It's usually someone's role in particularly in larger institutions to be able to gather together research opportunities, grant opportunities, to be able to have horizon scanning, looking at future grant opportunities that are likely to be coming up. So an awareness of what's available is often situated somewhere within your institutions, and that will vary depending on institution to institution. So starting those conversations early is always, I think, beneficial because others will have been looking at the spectrum of opportunities often for quite a long period of time. And thinking about who you can learn from. So thinking about where your mentors are situated, what kinds of experience others may have that you can draw on, and looking for those opportunities that will help support you develop that. And thinking also about the cycles of research. For myself, at least, my research moves in cycles. I am not always working in the same pace over time. And I can identify those patterns when I look back across kind of when I'm publishing, kind of where my grant income is coming from. So recognizing that we're not all working at the same speed all the time. And so thinking about when is the right time to apply, whether that's because your research is ready at a point that it's really fruitful to push for that grant income, whether it's in terms of thinking about kind of career development more broadly. So just thinking about where are you at in the cycles of research that might be relevant for you. So secondly, kind of learning from failure. We all fail at some point, and I think it's really important to say that. Pretty much, I imagine, I mean, this is, I haven't kind of tested this, but I would imagine that pretty much everybody who's applied for a grant at some time has been unsuccessful. And I think it is good that it's good practice to normalize that, to recognize that failure is also part of a kind of a normal everyday academic trajectory, rather than hiding it away and thinking that it's something that only happens to us and doesn't happen to others. I think that this is a kind of, it's okay to be able to talk about and to learn from what that experience brings to the table. And what's really important to say about that is it doesn't mean that your research is bad or the project isn't fundable. There are lots of reasons why we aren't successful in grant applications. And it often isn't about necessarily the quality of the research. That said, there's often always room to think about what you could do differently or what you could improve in looking at grant applications that weren't successful. And so what to do in that instance if the project isn't awarded? Is there feedback available? Can you request feedback from funding sources or reviewers? Some programs, some grants, some grant programs will offer feedback, others won't. So looking to see whether that's available to you can be helpful. And if there is, what did the reviewer say? Where is there room, do you think, for improvement? Seeking advice from people you trust. So sharing grant applications, looking for examples of good practice and drawing on those, sharing them with colleagues, looking for feedback from more senior colleagues who say, look, this didn't work out. What is there, and what advice do you have for how to think about this? So looking for that kind of access to support is really helpful. Grant writing is a skill and it can be learned. It is not something that is intuitive to most of us, and it is different from academic writing. It does not look like the kind of writing that we often think of in articles and books and so on. And I think it's important to say it doesn't come naturally necessarily to everybody, but it can be learned. And there are lots of resources out there that can help us think about what those different techniques look like. And your institutions are quite likely in many ways, I suspect, to provide some of those resources. If you're not successful, what does a grant application amount to? a lot of time, a lot of commitment, a lot of good ideas, a lot of emotional investment and intellectual investment go into the crafting of the kinds of research projects that we're often looking to get funded. If it's not successful, don't necessarily throw it away at the first attempt. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, it didn't get funded, so I put it in the drawer and forgot about it. But there may well be other ways, other places, other ways, alternative sources of funding. And so I'd really kind of encourage people to look for kind of other ways in which you can adjust or amend, think about tweaking the grant to make it suitable to apply somewhere else, or to integrate feedback into it so that you can have a go in different ways. But yeah, just because it's not successful the first time doesn't mean that it's not worth exploring and looking at in other ways. And lastly, thinking about balancing expectations and reality. I think a lot of academics, myself included, love to overpromise. I think we're very good at putting a lot of commitment into grant proposals. And that's often, I think, because kind of more equals better. And we think that the more we offer, the more persuasive our proposal will be, because we're committing to do more, kind of more. And there are questions about where these expectations come from, how we're shaped into thinking about those kinds of expectations, and how our productivity may be assessed by others, by our colleagues, by our institutions, by our disciplines. So while that kind of productivity is represented as desirable, I think it's really important to think about what's realistic when we're putting a grant application together. Not least because what happens if you get the grant and then you have to be able to deliver on the grant, and if you've overcommitted, or if you've made a lot of promises, and there are a range of consequences that it's worth thinking about if you then have to kind of meet all of them. One of which is of course thinking about the cycle of overwork that I think is often normalized, and the consequences that may have for health and well-being, for relationships, for good work-life balance. So thinking about how realistic we are in what we're setting out to do. And a few kind of tips for that, perhaps. I think always assume that everything is likely to take longer than you think it will. So factor in reasonable, realistic timelines in thinking about what your plan of work will look like. Seek feedback from others. What's reasonable? What's reasonable for the funder? What's reasonable in terms of outputs for the project? Are there innovative ways in which you can frame outputs that aren't necessarily about creating more, but thinking about how you're communicating and to whom you're communicating your research? Look at your overall workload. Where does this fit into it? And how much time will you have to give it? And thinking also along those lines, kind of, can you speak to your line manager? Is it possible to discuss the arrangements in advance in terms of what might be put in place to support you to enable this project, if it's successful, to be delivered? And of recognizing that the people are coming to thinking about research and grant applications from lots of different positions, from lots of different life experiences, with different kinds of caring responsibilities, of different, coming from different kinds of communities. And we know that there's evidence that kind of where funding falls is often within kind of more advantaged communities. So thinking about where there might be support and where adjustments might be made to ensure that the access to funding opportunities can be is open to all, and the likelihood of success in terms of thinking about the support is open to all. So recognizing that sometimes expectations are a challenge, and thinking about how we make those work for us rather than against us. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. That was really helpful. It really gave a wide context and put everything into perspective. You said two things that really resonated with me. The first was applying for funding from professional organizations. I think they're a really good resource. I second that. My first grant that enabled me to conduct my fieldwork was from the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies. They had a postgraduate grant. So I definitely encourage people to look there. The second thing is learning from failure. I think that's huge. And not all organizations provide feedback, but if they do, you can learn from that. And just, I think it was Samuel Beckett who said, try again, fail better. So that's something to keep in mind when applying for grants. So Leah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Naomi, we didn't plan this, but your ideas and presentation just fits really nicely into just like a little puzzle piece into what I've got for everyone this morning. Okay, so can everybody see my screen now? Yes, okay. So I'm Leah Windsor. I am an associate professor of applied linguistics in the Institute for Intelligent Systems and Department of English at the University of Memphis. And I have current NSF funding looking at embodied cognition and multimodal communication for applications for international relations research. And I got my first grant in 2013 from the U.S. Department of Defense, the Minerva Initiative, and I got hooked. I really love applying for grants, and I'm excited to share what I've learned in the past decade or so. Okay, so I'm going to start with a big picture overview. So my colleague Christian Cronstead and I did a survey of people in social sciences and humanities, and we asked everyone, who taught you how to write a grant? And most respondents said, nobody. I taught myself. So that's not necessarily encouraging, right? How do your graduate students learn to write grants? We do not teach graduate students how to write grants. Okay, good start. How important do you think writing grants and getting funded is currently in your discipline? Extremely important, very important. So we're seeing a mismatch already between the expectations and the training. So there's a real need for professionalization. And it's, writing a grant for the first time is a huge startup, learning curve cost. And as Naomi said, it is not intuitive. It's so different from academic writing, from traditional articles or books. And this is really part of the hidden curriculum in higher education that it's literally hidden, right? Like, we're not teaching people how to do this, and it's not intuitive. So how do we get experience? So I will direct you to this article, grant writing mentorship, grant writing in the hidden curriculum, mentoring and collaborating across disciplines. So this came out of a grant project, this current NSF grant project that Christian and I wrote together. Okay, so here's what I think the winning formula is. Your idea plus your persuasiveness, if it's plausible, being able to collaborate and work as a team, and having a mixture of both hard and soft skills, and then also the perseverance and luck. I think the perseverance, I'll get into in a minute, talking about learning from failure. And then what does success look like? So we're going to start with the idea. This is the three puzzles in search of a researcher that Dina Zinnes wrote, especially the first few pages of it. Just what is it that's puzzling you? What is your idea? You have to have a compelling idea. What is the thing that you want to explore? Why do you need funding for it? And then, especially if you're applying for National Science Foundation funding, you have to think in really tangible and meaningful ways about what the intellectual merit is of what you're doing, and also what the broader impacts are. These are things that you have to address substantively and really put a lot of thought into it. It's not just another box to check in the grant application process. You really have to demonstrate why this is a compelling idea. There's more and more people applying for grants. And so the increased competition means that you really have to sell your idea, and you have to think about what the merit is, and how this is going to affect not just international studies or international relations, but society, the people that you're working with, your graduate students and undergraduate students too. So you have to start, your idea is really the foundation of everything. And you may have an idea and see a funding opportunity, but it doesn't quite match up. And so I would say if you're trying to shoehorn the idea or make it fit, it's probably not going to be a good fit, and that's not a good use of your time. So find a good grant fit for what your idea is. Don't try and force your idea into a call for proposals where that's not really what they want to fund, because generally the funding agencies will tell you what they're interested in funding. Okay, persuasiveness. So depending on where you're applying for funding, you may have someone who is in your discipline, but in general, you should think about writing for a well-educated reviewer who may or may not be from your discipline or field. And what this really means is no jargon. And that's hard because we spend all of our lives in graduate school becoming fluent in the jargon of our discipline, and that's our currency, right? That's how we show our in-group status. That's how we show that we know the word rational in political science means something very different and specific as compared to rational in everyday conversation. And so the words that have very particularized meaning, or even trendy catchphrases, the highly jargonized language is not good for grant writing proposals. You need to write in plain language for someone who is not part of the in-group. The second point is that if there's a call for proposals and they say, this is the type of work that we want to fund, look at the language that they use in the call for proposals. So RFP is request for funding proposal, or BAA is a broad area announcement, notice of funding opportunity. So for example, in my work, I study language and politics. And so if I'm reading the call for proposals and they are saying text analysis, and that's the language that they're using. Well, we can talk about analyzing language in a lot of different ways. We can call it text analysis. We can call it text as data. We might call it discourse analysis or political language. But if the call for proposals is using a particular turn of phrase to describe something, just use that. You don't need to make it interesting or use multiple different terms for the same thing for fear of being repetitive. Just use the exact language that they're presenting in the call for proposals, because that will show that you understand what they want, right? In linguistics, we call this linguistic style matching. And it shows a rapport between speakers and listeners, or between audiences. And so you can just use the exact terminology that they use in their call for proposals. The other thing with persuasiveness is showing and telling. It doesn't all have to be all words. If there are pictures that illustrate or graphs, or if you have pilot or preliminary data to show, or if you have a flow chart, the showing and telling aspect is really useful as a proof of concept for what you want to do. And those are perfectly fine. You know, you don't necessarily need to go into the you know, deep statistical models if that's part of the you know, or formulas or anything like that. It can still be a high level overview. You don't have to get, you know, super granular about the methodology, but it's good to show that you have a working knowledge of the domain, especially if this is a kind of emerging area. Okay, plausibility. Can you do what you're proposing to do? Can it actually be accomplished? Can it be accomplished in the time frame that you have? And can it be accomplished with the funding that you're requesting? Because when the reviewers are looking at how much you're asking for in your budget and what you want to accomplish, and there's a mismatch, that's going to be a red flag for them. So ask for what you need, and certainly don't under budget, but you also have to be realistic. So many overlaps between what Naomi said and this, and we totally didn't plan it. So ask for what you need, and make it feasible, so that it's there's something called a Gantt chart, Gantt, and that's part of the plausibility, is building out your research design over the course of time for the funding. And the other part of the plausibility is that do you, and if you have a team working with you, have the necessary skills to do what you want to accomplish? Do you have the necessary equipment or infrastructure to do what you need? All of this has to supports the convincibility of your proposal. Okay, and then we have hard and soft skills. So I've got this quote on here from one of my favorite authors, Lisa Feldman Barrett, where she says, other people's opinions are just electrical activity in their brains, right? And this has to do maybe with the soft skills part of this. Part of grant writing is you have to be resilient, right? And you have to have thick skin. And so I didn't put the resilience part on the soft skills. But getting a grant is going to move you into a different frame of reference in your academic career than you may have been trained in, or you may be completely unprepared, right? Although many departments and research communities within the international studies and political science realms are moving toward a lab model, many of us were not trained in running a research lab in the same way that chemists run a research lab, or even psychologists run a research lab. That's changing, but part of running a lab is onboarding people and training them, and maybe having to fire them. It may be, part of the resilience, when you get the reviews back from your grant, and if you don't get it the first time or second or third, it may be hard to read the reviews, but that's when you have to remember that other people's opinions are just electrical activity in their brains, and that a rough review is not a referendum on your worth as a human being. So take what's valuable about what the reviewers say and use that, and then just let everything else go. The hard skills that you have to have, are the things like the rigorous workflow management. When you get a grant, you can't afford to work idiosyncratically, right? You have to think about this. You have to really professionalize and become more rigorous in your workflow, because not only are you responsible for your own work, you are now the steward of resources that other people are giving to you, and you also likely will have to supervise other people. So you have to be really organized. So, the you have to have the skills to do whatever data collection and analysis. You have to have the budgeting. You may have to learn new software to approve people's effort and track, effort over time. And that kind of gets into the soft skills too. So the personnel management. I got to go through team science training a few years ago, and that really helped me to think, especially in interdisciplinary work, about different expectations and disciplinary norms and standards. Time management becomes much more important when you get a grant because you are on a fixed timeline. And so, it really is a luxury to be able to work idiosyncratically, which may be something that's quite attractive, in academia, is that we can make our own schedules, but you have to become a lot more rigorous and disciplined in your workflow time. The other thing that I'll mention too is that communicating your science or your research to other people is really important. And that goes to the broader impacts, component of the grant. One of the ways that I do this is with the message box. There's a group called Compass Science Communication, and I went through one of their workshops a few years ago. And this is pretty much how I do all of my abstracts, how I build out an idea from, just the kernel of what I'm curious about to how am I going to go about studying this. So the message box is really useful. Okay. So perseverance and luck. There's a lot of things in the grant writing process that you can't control. You can't control how many other people submit proposals in that funding cycle. You can't control how much is in the granting agency's budget. You can't control if you get reviewer 2, right? And this comes back to like other people's opinions are just electrical activity in their brains. But here's the perseverance part. Christian Cronstead and I asked, what percentage of unfunded or unsuccessful grants do you resubmit for funding? So about half of the grants get resubmitted for funding, but most of them never get resubmitted for funding at all, right? This is extraordinarily inefficient and something that learning from failure, if you don't get funded, you can take that idea and you can take even the words that you use to write the grant and put that into a thought piece or, an article and get that published or get it under review and continue to refine your grant. So you can take the words from your grant proposal and turn those into an article. And think about this as a recursive process of continually refining and presenting, maybe present the idea at a conference and get some feedback. So one of my core values is no one-offs. You need to get multiple products from every effort, whether it's a grant proposal, an article. You can always write an op-ed piece or something for the conversation or the monkey cage or the duck of Minerva, or you need to get multiple products out of every single effort. Okay, so what does success look like? What happens when the dog finally catches the car, right? So sometimes getting a grant can have some positive externalities, right? It can improve your workflow and your efficiency. It can raise your disciplinary and professional profile. It can lead to getting future grants and finding new collaborators. It can generate new information about the world, right? Sometimes it's required, not necessarily getting funding, but submitting funding proposals, sometimes required for promotion or tenure. That said, there are some negative externalities as well. Grants can delay your publication pipeline, sometimes for years. I had a grant that got held up for a year and a half in the Department of Defense's IRB, their own internal IRB. And if you are on the traditional 6-year pre-tenure clock, that year and a half is going to be really costly, right? And also sometimes data collection just takes time. And sometimes with this current project, we didn't know what we were going to find. And so we're sort of building the airplane as we're flying it and seeing where the ideas are taking us. So, this may delay your publication pipeline, and depending on your what you need for your metrics of success and progression in your career, that can be an impediment. There is more administrivia in grant management than you can ever imagine. Keeping track of people and paperwork and budgets and effort certification and all kinds of things that nobody ever tells us about. Personnel management is also can be challenging. With this particular grant, as soon as we got the grant, one of my collaborators became dean of the graduate school. Another one two of them left the university. One of them has an incredibly busy international travel schedule, and there was a pandemic. And so it's, people have lives, and those lives, are inextricably linked to the outcomes of your grant and how well it functions. Okay, that's what I got for you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Leah. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on right to Mark so we can have maximum time for questions after. Mark, on to you.
Thank you, and I'll apologize in advance. I seem to be losing my voice progressively today, so we'll see how far I get, but I'll probably keep it relatively brief. Much of what I'm going to say complements what Naomi and Leah have already said in a lot of ways, but I'm going to go down a slightly different path because my path as a grant getter and a grant-based researcher is a little different than most folks, I think, in the international studies field. And again, that's just typical. You follow the line of argument, the ideas that work for you, and you find the funding that does work for you. And so for me, that meant a lot of really foundationally interdisciplinary work. And so this, in a lot of ways, I just fell into it. Some of it was my upbringing as a grad student and then a junior faculty member, and I was doing simulation work. And in the end, I sought out an educational psychology colleague of mine at the University of Connecticut, who I had never met before, to generate ideas about doing simulation work, and I'll come back to that in a couple minutes. And most recently, I've been doing environmental work, which has taken me down an entirely different path. But in a lot of ways, the work that I have done has happened because I was open to odd ideas. And I mean odd in the best kind of way. Things that wouldn't have necessarily been on the normal political science, geography, international studies agenda for most scholars, but they were presented to me and I said, sure. And so, and I realized that we're all at different places in our careers, but I would encourage you, when you get presented with an interesting or creative opportunity, be inclined to say yes, okay? Even if it's something that's a little bit weird for you, because I certainly have found that the odd things, the weird stuff has been the most fun and the most creative and certainly the most fundable that I have encountered throughout my career. And if you're looking for these kinds of things. Before I get into two specific examples, briefly, I will also echo the whole idea of failure. And in fact, I have a talk that I've probably delivered a dozen times now that it's called, it's all about batting average. And so for those of you who know a little bit about American baseball, a Hall of Fame hitter fails 70% of the time. And so I often tell students about this, that, somebody who's really good as an athlete is an enormous failure but it's that 30% success rate, which is frankly about where my my positive grant evaluations have been, and probably also my journal article evaluations have been in that 30% range. And, you know, I've done okay. And so, but you have to be able to deal with a lot of failure. You have to be able to synthesize those ideas. And sometimes it is, yes, you have to pay attention to those reviewers, but sometimes you also get reviewers who are just wrong. Okay. So you also have to be good at evaluating those things and having colleagues that you can run these reviews by and get advice from colleagues and mentors about when somebody is really off track or when they are providing you with good constructive advice. So let me just give you two examples before my voice completely goes out here. So the first one started in 1998 when I sought out this educational psychologist, and who has now become a close friend and collaborator of 25 years. But I just happened to find him, and we submitted a grant to a small agency, which over about 15 years generated about $6 million in funded research, mostly from the U.S. Department of Education. And so I was looking at the way gender impacted negotiation and approaches to negotiation. And my colleague Scott was using it about learning styles and the way students learn about international studies and phenomenon outside of the United States, how they synthesize information. And he refers to that as knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, KABs. And so he was looking at the educational psychology, how do students learn? I was looking at data, qualitative data on different negotiation styles, and we had stuff published in ISQ, we've had stuff published in many other, top line journals out of that project. And we wouldn't have been doing that kind of work if it hadn't been foundationally interdisciplinary and collaborative in a very big way. And so, and it was great to mentor graduate students through that environment, but it did mean that we had to go through a whole series of funding initiatives. We had to resubmit and go through those processes because we didn't hit the first time. Okay. But we did hit the second, third, and fourth times. And sometimes once you get into that realm, the funding agency says, well, we've got this other program. We really like what you do. And so, boom, over here, and you get into that mill, which works out well. The second thing is, over the last 10 to 15 years of my career, I've been doing almost exclusively environmental work, and particularly around climate adaptation. And I started working with some folks at the University of Connecticut's Extension Service, which is the outreach or organization of the university in the U.S. context that goes out and helps towns and local governments and things like that do what they need to do. And one of the things that we found in our collaborative work together is particularly small towns don't have the expertise and don't have the staff resources to be able to do work on climate change, even though they may want to. And so we put together this program that was initially just focused on climate adaptation work, but we looked at that and said, how can we provide workforce development for students? How can we provide expertise and staffing? And so we developed a course where we train students on climate adaptation work. Those students then get farmed out as interns in their second semester in that program. And the towns get to develop climate adaptation plans. They get to develop natural hazard mitigation plans. And this is then expanded into stormwater management programs, as well as brownfields redevelopment. And so, ironically, we applied to NOAA in the US. NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. And we applied for about $350,000 just as we were going from the Obama to the Trump years. They cut all the funding. We had positive reviews, and we didn't get that $350,000 to launch the E-Corps, as we now call it. And I see somebody mentioned over in the chat that she was in the E-Corps program. Great, absolutely wonderful. But as we looked at that, we then applied to NSF's IUSE program, which is inherently interdisciplinary. And we had colleagues from the School of Engineering, We had colleagues from the School of Education, colleagues from the College of Ag, and myself, I'm in liberal arts and sciences. So we had 4 schools and colleges around the university. We applied to NSF and we got $2.5 million over 5 years to run the E-Corps and to develop this. And it's still running. And we're now looking at what's next. What's the follow-on? How can we embed this? And it's really a transportable model. And it's a lot of fun, okay, to be able to do these kinds of things and reach out to towns who really need this kind of work. I wouldn't be doing this if I was in the traditional international studies domain. But again, I followed in the environmental realm. I'm a macro international relations guy. And I just followed the fact that where the really interesting work on climate is being done is at the state and local level. It's actually not being done at the macro global level. Lots of talk, lots of negotiation, but not a lot of action. And so you follow the interesting thread, you follow the interesting line of argument. And so, there's a lot to play with. And so say yes, okay, when you get an interesting proposal put forward, look for those really interesting interdisciplinary edges, because those are oftentimes where the big funding is, if you can get a group of folks together. So I'm going to stop there and I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Mark. You just made the whole process sound like so exciting. I was on the edge of my seat. Okay, so we have time for questions now. If people want to put their questions in the chat or the Q&A or raise their hands, those are all options, whatever works best for you. And I am just monitoring now to see if there are any questions. Let's see. Do people see the question for Melanie in the chat?
So depending on your institution, there's a resource called Grant Forward that you can click what your interests are. I don't know if there's a free version or a limited version of that, but you can also, there's lots of listservs, so you can, get things just come to your email inbox. Maybe not every day. I like to get the weekly batches. So you can set that up so that you get all of the announcements in one fell swoop. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's partly a product of being a little bit aggressive. Usually there's somebody at a college or a university who provides a clearinghouse, and you can go to him or her and say, I want to do this. I have an idea. Can you help me search them? They'll at least get you rolling. And so that's a start. But the notion of getting on some of the listservs, while it is a pain in the neck to get all of those emails, that's oftentimes where you find out what's out there and what a new orientation is. And, and asking a colleague that's been doing similar kinds of work, or not similar kinds of work for that matter, and to be able to play around with those kinds of things. So, yes.
So I know, Mark, you and Leah are both in the U.S. context. I'm wondering, Naomi, if you would share the same approach being based in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are obviously kind of different listservs that apply. There are different kind of websites that do collect some of these things together. So looking in your own country context, and again asking for help. So going to whoever's responsible kind of for doing some of this kind of research support work. Speaking to colleagues in your department and asking where do they get their information from? Because I mean, as Leah was saying, we're not trained to write grant applications, and along with that, we're not trained to know where to look for grant for income either. And so, kind of the hive mind in a sense can often be really helpful, and I think probably is underused in terms of sharing this knowledge. And so thinking about who you can look to ask. And they will often be able to point you in the direction of the kinds of websites, listservs, and of key kind of key information where some of these things from different funders may be gathered together, or institutionally where they can be signposted.
And I would just jump on, particularly with regards to Sybil's comment in the chat. There is going to be some administrative work that you're going to have to do, but if you can, it does help to get affiliated in some way with a research center at your college or university, because usually there'll be a grants person there who does this kind of work, and so you can get some of the help on budgeting, the help on just all of the little details that you have to keep track of. But then also your office of sponsored programs, or whatever it's called, will also usually have a post-award person or more that does this kind of work. So you need to be aggressive in seeking them out, because you're not going to want all of the little pieces on your desk if you can avoid it. So you do want to have that infrastructure support at your college or university, and I think that's important to seek out.
I see there's a Q&A thing that popped up from Yanni, maybe. How many times should we reapply? Well, until you get tired of reapplying, or until you get it, right? So this current NSF that I have, I got the grant on my 4th try. So it's not necessarily that your idea isn't good. It's a product of all of those things that I said are beyond your control, right? How many other people are applying, how much they've got in their budget, how compelling a case. I mean, every time I applied, we moved a little bit further down the road, right? In the way that we were thinking about and talking about the project. And then there are a couple other ones in here. So the idea of the extra challenges that might arise for applying for a grant with a multinational consortium. Not just multinational, but multidisciplinary. So when I was talking earlier about the jargon issue, if you are working across disciplines, much less across time zones or institutions, it gets much more complicated. One of the things that I found is that sometimes we use the same word to describe very different things, or we use different words to describe the same process or the same idea. And so figuring out how to talk to each other before you even think about talking to a funding agency is that's part of the hurdle. But with the multinational consortium, that gets into some more technical details of subawards and coordination problems, like in the IO literature, kind of coordination problems thinking. And then to Sybil's question, this is one of my most favorite things to do, is to build out budgets. So I'm happy to talk with you offline about that. But the way to think about that big picture is, so if you Google Gantt chart, GANTT, it's about the time. So think about it like maybe year 1, year 2, year 3, and then all the major stages of the project and what you want to accomplish and when that's going to be accomplished. So it's kind of like a spreadsheet. But then once you figure out what you want to accomplish, you put a $ next to that, right? Like, how much is it going to cost for me to do that? How much of my time is that going to cost? Do I need software for that? Do I need a research assistant, right? So everything gets a $ attached. And so you're building out the scope of the project alongside the budget of the project.
Just to jump in on that, a couple of things I'd add. One, in terms of the specialized software, it's really worth looking at what funders consider eligible costs. So most funders will provide very clear lists of eligible and ineligible costs, and looking kind of very early on to make sure that what you need will be provided by the funder is absolutely time well spent. Also, you may have finance and finance officers in your institution who will help you put the budget together. Putting a budget together is very daunting. Leah, it is not my strong point. And looking for where there's support who do this as part of that's part of their job to support researchers and pulling budgets together and understanding what your own university will charge for X, Y, and Z is also really time well spent, because you're not having to work all of that out from scratch, and you have kind of assistance in structuring the expectations, which mean that when you come to put it in, everything is lined up. You've dotted the I's, you've crossed the T's, everything is already in place, because it will have been checked by those whose kind of bread and butter is looking at finances and budgetary responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, so there, for example, some grants won't let you purchase computers, but they will let you purchase software. We just had to go through the process. We call it unlike circumstances at our university, which means there is literally there are no computers or equipment on campus that can do what I need for it to do in order for me to be able to accomplish this. And because one of my collaborators left the university and he had all the specialized stuff, we had to submit this form so that I could buy a special computer to run this special software to do the thing that we need to do in the grant. So there are ways to work around, what you can and can't budget for. Yes. But those things, the granting officers will probably ask you what you need and tell you if that falls within the scope. But sometimes you don't know what you need until you're in the middle of it. And I think this is also where mentorship comes in. And there's a lot of different thoughts on whether or not junior or pre-tenure scholars should be PIs on project. I kind of alluded to this with the delay in the publication process, but this is a really nice thing that people who are either past the tenure and promotion benchmark or more senior in the field can do the heavy lifting and the administrivia, so that the junior scholars don't have to undertake all of that, the huge learning curve, and you can see how things are done, without needing to be the primary responsible party for all of those, details.
And sometimes when you need something that your grant will not fund, your dean's office or your research office will pitch in as matching funds or as something else along the way. And one of the things that I found was that, I was a little more aggressive than the average faculty member. I would ask 15 people until I got yes at my university. And so sometimes you just need to be really creative about who you're talking to, and you will eventually find, the answer that you want or need, but you have to be persistent.
Yes, I did this at the end of last spring semester. I wanted to do a 10-week grant writing incubator workshop for the Women's Plus Mentorship Network at the University of Memphis. And I was able to cobble together $6,000 from the provost's office, the College of Arts and Sciences, College of Education, a big research center on campus, a couple of departments. And what I did was said, do you have money that you can't carry forward after the end of the fiscal year? And if so, can I have it? And here's what I want to do with it. And so I was able just to piece together, a small pool of money to be able to pay these 26 pairs of brand new principal investigators. It wasn't a lot, I think they each got $100 for the 10-week course, which is like enough to buy a cup of coffee every week. But it was more than nothing, right? And so you can cobble together, you have to be proactive and creative, and self-advocating, which itself is a soft skill too. If you have your good kernel of your idea, you should be willing to fight for it. And that means reaching out and showing people on your campus and in the field, in your discipline, that this is worth paying attention to?
Just to maybe add to some of that, I mean, I think it's worth recognizing that, and there are a lot of inequalities baked into the structures of academia, and not all of these things are equally possible or accessible for everybody in the same way. And I think kind of recognizing where those barriers exist and thinking about, on the one hand, where can you look for forms of knowledge that have grappled with and have recognized these kinds of barriers. Kind of networks and allyship within your institution is really important in thinking about, one, how can you be proactive in supporting other colleagues in kind of recognizing and addressing those barriers, but also kind of where are there forms of knowledge that bring these into the light and kind of allow them to be more accessible. And a lot of work is being done again by professional associations and both in the UK and I know by ISA that are really trying to work to recognize some of the ways in which these inequalities are shaping professional opportunities. And so again, they're using those resources and looking at some of the evidence that's being produced within professional in collaboration with professional associations and funding bodies as well are also becoming more aware of this. So yeah, thinking about ways in which to address some of these, recognizing that they're not all equal for everybody.
And also, if you get told no, there's a lot of different meanings for no. Sometimes no means it's genuinely not possible, but sometimes, if you ask for funding or ask if something, if you can do something, no just might mean that they don't want to do it, right? Or it would be difficult, or it's never been done before. So, you have to kind of tease out what that no means. If you're asking for funding or if you're asking for support in some way, especially for internal funding. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've pretty much answered all of the questions here. Thank you so much, Naomi, Mark, and Leah. This was really helpful, really informative today. All right, everybody, have a good day.
Thank you so much, ISA.